The scope of Britain's Islamic finance market is widening, with several initiatives from the government and private sector. Last June, as was mentioned, Britain became the first Western country to sell sovereign sukuks. That followed an initiative by the Bank of England earlier in May, in which it widened the types of Sharia-compliant debt instruments that Islamic banks can use in their liquidity buffers. Taken together, the new official initiatives seem likely to create a more flexible and efficient environment for Islamic finance to operate in. So how can the City of London use its status as an international hub for finance, the expertise of its practitioners, and its legal principles and frameworks to advance Islamic finance? Our next keynote speaker is a lawyer, a businesswoman, a campaigner, among many roles, but she is best known for being the first Muslim to serve in a British cabinet. She established and co-chaired the UK's governance first ministerial task force on Islamic finance and is credited for the UK sukuk issuance that I just mentioned. So please join me in welcoming Baroness Sayeeda Warsi.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sheikha, Governor, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I have two bits of good news for you. One, that Jassim overrun on his presentation, which means that I didn't start at 9:45. And secondly, the further good news that I will not be speaking for 45 minutes, as it says in the program. My husband has a famous saying. I don't know how many of you understand Urdu, but it goes something like this, कि सियासतदानों की तकरीरें तब ही अच्छी लगती हैं जब वो छोटी होती हैं, which loosely translates as this: the best speeches from politicians are very short ones. Ladies and gentlemen, not long after we formed the coalition government in 2010, the Prime Minister David Cameron returned from a visit to Malaysia, having received one of those famous firm talks from Governor Zeti, and he was very keen to see what more the United Kingdom could do in developing Islamic finance. And it's where my journey with Islamic finance began. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the rates of growth in the Islamic finance market, our time zone sitting at the center of global capital markets, English as the global language of business, the expertise in our professional services industry, our world-class academic institutions offering specialized training courses and qualifications, and our talented multilingual, multicultural workforce, all of these made it seem for me obvious that London should not be just one of the world's leading financial centers, but one of the world's leading Islamic financial centers too. Now, as many of you are aware, over the last 3 decades, the United Kingdom has already put in place a series of policies to help start and develop the UK's position. But once London became the first city outside of the Islamic world to host the World Islamic Economic Forum, I knew that that provided the best platform and focus for the UK to reset out its stall. The World Islamic Economic Forum 2013 was a resounding success, with 1,800 political and business leaders from over 155 countries attending. And the package of announcements were impressive: an Islamic index on the London Stock Exchange, the launch of the first Islamic insurance underwriting agency, the London Market Group, which sits within Lloyd's of London, developing a trade body, the Islamic Insurance Association, to look specifically at developing UK expertise in Islamic insurance, Islamic compliant student loans, Islamic compliant startup loans, and the Global Islamic Finance and Investment Group, which I had the privilege of chairing in government. A group which brings together premiers, ministers, CEOs of major Islamic banks, central bank governors and regulators, people who can make a real difference to the global landscape, to examine the key global opportunities and barriers facing Islamic finance. But for me, ladies and gentlemen, the highlight and my personal success was the landmark announcement which we promised to be the first Western government to issue a sovereign sukuk. Something I was told could not be done, something I was told would not be done, something we had been told that we had floated before as an idea and not delivered on, but something which many of you loudly and clearly told me had to be done, as much for financial reasons as for the UK's credibility in this area. Well, alhamdulillah, in June of this year, we delivered on that promise. We issued 200 million of sovereign sukuk, and orders for the issuance totaled £2.3 billion, nearly 12 times oversubscribed. Now, let me tell you, it wasn't an easy journey to sukuk. In fact, about a fortnight or 8 days before we made the announcement, we were still debating whether the building which was going to be attached to the sukuk could be a building where people could bring in bacon sandwiches for breakfast, and whether that would make it non-compliant. However, after many discussions and almost becoming an expert in Sharia-compliant finance, we issued that sukuk. So what next? Well, I'm convinced that this achievement has inspired the potential further issuance of sukuk by corporates. We expect to see UK Export Finance, UKEF, the UK's export credit agency, move into the sukuk market. Since the global financial crisis, UKEF's 100% guarantee product has played a key role in supporting customers of Airbus aircraft and Rolls-Royce engines. A UKEF guaranteed Islamic sukuk product is a natural step to extend the scope and appeal of this guarantee. Like conventional capital market guarantees, it will be available for use in a range of currencies to suit all customers. And our early indications are that its pricing would be consistent with the conventional capital markets product. The government's ambition is that this sukuk will be rolled out to a range of other customers and other sectors. The UK, with its extensive infrastructure programme, too, is benefiting from Islamic finance. Deals with a series of flagship projects only now becoming possible because of Islamic finance. And finally, an area where many of you have discussed with me endlessly over the last few years, the challenges Islamic banks face meeting their liquidity requirements. The Bank of England, who were represented at the inaugural meeting of the Global Islamic Finance and Investment Group, were left in no doubt at that meeting by the industry as to the urgency of this. The good news is that the Bank of England will begin feasibility work next year on establishing a Sharia-compliant facility. And I'm sure that the industry will continue to apply pressure for real progress to be made. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm not a banker. Indeed, I'm not even an Islamic finance expert. I'm a politician. And I enjoy these conferences. I particularly enjoy conferences involving bankers because after the financial crisis, that makes me as a politician marginally more popular than you are. But you will see from my Islamic finance journey that I don't just talk the talk, but I also walk the walk. And when His Excellency the Governor and I spoke last week, I asked him what I should cover in my keynote speech. And he said, Sayeeda, the audience won't just want to hear about Islamic finance, they'll want to hear about you, the politician, and specifically about those weeks and days this summer when, having had the privilege of serving as the first Muslim in a British cabinet, you gave it all up for Gaza. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't walk away from government for Gaza. I walked away from government for my principles. And those principles are not just based on my Islam, but on universal principles rooted in humanity. A simple belief that as people in public positions of authority, we should say what we mean, and we should do what we say. That as leaders, we should not seek power for power's sake, but seek position and power to make a difference. And when your hands are on the levers of power, but you are not making a difference on a policy where sadly we could not even find the language and the words to condemn, a policy which I felt was not in line with our commitment to human rights and international justice, and not in tune with our British values, a policy which I felt was clearly morally indefensible, then the only morally defensible stance is to give that position back. As a young child born to an immigrant mill worker, I could not in my wildest dreams envisage that one day I would serve my country at the highest table in the land. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a privilege that I will always cherish. But what I will cherish even more is that in the heady world of politics, I never stopped being the politician who didn't just talk the talk, but also walked the walk. Thank you.
Baroness Warsi, we're not going to let you go that easily. My microphone wasn't up early enough to ask you to stay with us on stage. So can I ask you to come back for a few minutes of Q&A, because I'm sure that so many people have a lot of questions for you this morning. So I will be giving you the chance to address your questions for our guests. But maybe to kickstart the conversation, let me start with a couple of questions of my own. We will start by Baroness Warsi, the advocate of the advancement of Islamic finance in the UK, and then maybe move on to your journey as a politician, and which you ended your presentation with. When we say City of London is the highest profile city in terms of finance in the world. We're talking about the international stage. Do you think that Islamic finance, or what do you think should be done? Do you see Islamic finance as achieving that international status that City of London represents?
Mm-hmm. I think, as I said in my presentation, if you look at all the various factors that I outlined in my speech, for me it was a no-brainer that London should be making a case to be one of the world's leading centres on Islamic finance, as it is on finance generally. And the phrase that I used throughout my time in government when we were looking at these products was that we needed to see an Islamic finance market that didn't sleep. And to ensure that, London needed to be part of that, because there was a point when lots of other places were sleeping and London was not. I think uniquely, because of the many decades of development on regulation and various other changes that we've made to our laws in the United Kingdom, the Islamic finance market has been developing. But I think most practitioners would accept that we went through a period of stagnation. I think the last 2 or 3 years have hopefully reinvigorated some of that work. And I think it's now up to the industry to ensure that even if you haven't got somebody championing this now from a ministerial position, that we continue to make the progress in the United Kingdom. I know that my colleague Andrea Leadsom, who's now in the Treasury, is very keen to take this work forward, but I would urge you as an industry, you've got to keep the pressure on, especially as we approach a general election and post a general election, when politicians don't think about much other than general elections.
We know that, as has been mentioned earlier in the speeches, that Islamic finance cannot operate in a vacuum. It needs the enabling environment. Do you think that with your discussions with the UK authorities, there is a willingness from both on the legal level, or let's say on the regulatory level, and on the monetary authorities level, that there is a willingness to cooperate and to create this enabling environment for Islamic banks to be able to operate in the UK?
Mm-hmm. I think, if I'm completely honest, the initial response from most areas is threefold. The first one is what's broken, so why are we fixing it? The second one is, don't you think we've got enough problems at the moment with the financial crisis? Why should we start a whole new set of issues? And the third one is actually quite worryingly, and this is what I sensed at the start, that because Islamic finance is called Islamic finance, it therefore comes with some baggage. I think people here will not be offended when I say that in parts of the world, including in Europe, brand Islam is broken. Islam, when you talk about something connected to Islam, doesn't carry certain connotations. And so I spent nearly 12 months briefing journalists and speaking mainly to the right-wing media, trying to convince them that this was not jihadi banking by stealth, that we were not going to be taken over by the Arabs, that we were not going to have all our assets taken off to the Middle East. I mean, these were quite concerning conversations, the level of misunderstanding and mistrust that there was, despite the fact that the economic case was so obvious. But alhamdulillah, we managed to overcome those issues, and for me, I felt the biggest barrier to not progressing on this area was political will. And I think once we had the Prime Minister behind it and the political will was there, we saw huge progress.
Basically, this means that the industry has a challenge to promote the image of the industry as a whole in order to be able to reach those audiences that are not non-Muslim customers.
Well, it's one of the things that came out at the Global Islamic Finance and Investment Group. One of the strongest messages we got at that first meeting was that we needed to have a set of messages around Islamic finance that focused on the principles and the values rather than the Islamic aspect of it, even though those principles are based on Islamic values and principles. At a time after the global crisis when there is such a huge desire and need for banking with a soul, here was a ready-made solution. And we just needed to be able to sell that, and that needed to be done in a way where institutions needed to think quite creatively. So, for example, one of the problems we have in the United Kingdom is with money being loaned at incredibly extortionate interest rates. We have a real problem with loan sharks, and it's an ongoing challenge with it for us in Parliament. Now, of course, if Islamic finance is about making finance available for the financially excluded, here was a unique opportunity to tap into a sentiment that existed in the United Kingdom. And I think that those are the kind of areas which in the end will give it a great reputation amongst non-Muslims.
Let us get some questions from the audience. If you have a question for our guests, please can you raise your hand, and there are roving microphones that we can pass on to you to ask your questions. Are there any questions? To Mr. Adnan Youssef, if you can pass on a roving microphone to the first row.
Yes, there is a question from the back.
Okay, so someone has already the microphone. Let them ask first, and then we will move on to Mr. Youssef. Please introduce yourself, because I cannot see where it is. Introduce yourself.
Okay,
where do you work, and
well.
address your question.
Yeah, my name is Richard Ellis. I'm from the Central Bank of Bahrain. I'd like to ask Baroness Warsi, please. We've heard from you this morning what it took to make you leave the UK Cabinet. What might it take to get you back into the UK Cabinet?
Well, of course, as you are aware, Richard, every person in Cabinet is appointed at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. Of course, you know, at 43, I wouldn't write off if I was ever given the opportunity to serve again at the Cabinet table. But it would have to be once our position and our policy on the Middle East had changed. I have a very clear view. You cannot have a two-state solution until you recognize both states. So one of the first things that we could do is recognize the state of Palestine, followed by accountability for war crimes that are committed on either side in that part, so that we do not have a system where every 2 years innocent people lose their lives and nobody is held to account. If we genuinely believe in human rights and international justice, and I believe that in Britain we do, and as the Minister who had responsibility for human rights, the United Nations and international justice, we have to be very clear. If we say the things and if we genuinely believe in them, then we have to apply them consistently across the world. Because it's when we apply policies inconsistently that we make bad decisions.
Baroness Warsi, let me just follow up on this and just play the devil's advocate. Isn't it always better to be on the inside and change rather than try to change from the outside?
I completely agree with you, and government is all about making compromises. Government is consistently, you disagree with your colleagues and you find a middle way and you find a solution. I've been in frontline ministerial work now for nearly 8 years, and in those 8 years there are many occasions where I've had disagreements and we've come through, and I've not always been happy with the compromise, but it's something that I can live with. But when you are involved in an issue and every day you're having to stand before Parliament and say things that you do not believe in, and you also know that whichever logical argument you make, you still cannot convince your colleagues that our policy is not the right policy right now, then you have to question yourself. Are you staying simply because it's a great job, and it is? Or are you staying because you're making a difference? And at that point, I knew in my heart of hearts that I was not making a difference to the policy. And one of the things that I always said was that long after politics has come and gone, you have to be able to live with yourself. And I feel today, alhamdulillah, I can live with myself.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Adnan Ahmed Yusuf, Chief Executive of Al Baraka Banking Group. First of all, on behalf of all the participants, we'd like to thank you very much for your stand for Gaza, because this is something which is very close to our heart. I have 2 questions, as a matter of fact. The first question was already raised by Richard, and I would like to thank him very much. The second question is, we have for the past 2 days our strategy meeting of Al Baraka Banking Group, and we have about 60 people coming from 15 countries. And one of the things which is on our agenda is the expansion worldwide. And we thought about certain countries, especially in Africa and also in the middle of Asia. But we want to see also your views from the European side. Where do you think that the Islamic financing, especially now UK they have a few Islamic banks. Do you think that the European countries, because of your positions and because of your contact in Europe, do you think that they are open for the Islamic financing? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think first of all, thank you very much for your kind words. I think like I said, I'm not an expert in Islamic finance, so take my views with a pinch of salt. You're the experts. But one of the things I found quite interesting during the 3.5 years that I was involved in this was that every bank who was interested in the European market seemed to pitch their tent towards European Muslims. Now, European Muslims are a tiny minority in each of these individual countries. And any bank that sets its stall out for a tiny minority of a population will never have the economies of scale, so therefore will never provide the service which is required, which means it will never be popular, which means it's a downward vicious cycle. Whereas if the products that were being offered and if the service that was being offered was mainstreamed, which is what I was saying, if we go back to what the principles of this are, the thirst and desire for ethical banking is huge. Not just in the United Kingdom, but across Europe. The financial crisis made a lot of people stop and think about leveraging, over-leveraging, risk sharing. Islamic finance has an answer to all of those issues. And I think uniquely, and this is what the Global Islamic Finance and Investment Group was looking at, as an industry, you have to work out what that public relations exercise looks like. Islam needs a public relations exercise, and therefore Islamic finance needs a public relations exercise. And Islamic finance in many ways is the answer to many of the misunderstanding that there is about Islam. And if therefore the industry can pitch it right. I would love, and I don't know what your corporate social responsibility agendas look like, but one of the things that I keep talking about, and maybe I'll have somebody will offer me it today, I would love for Islamic finance houses and banks to support credit unions in the United Kingdom. Credit unions are for those people who are generally financially excluded. I want the financially excluded to be the market and to be included when Islamic finance sets its stall out in the United Kingdom.
Baroness Warsi, I want to thank you for being with us, and I apologize again for bringing you back on stage. Thank you very much for being with us, and I'm sure many of your messages resonate with our audience here, and I hope that you will be able to achieve more and more in your journey in the UK. Thank you very much.